At dawn in rural Maryland, 1842, a midwife screamed and dropped the child. Not because it was dead, but because it was watching her. Its eyes were open, wide, unblinking, glassy as river stone. Not blue, not brown, something else. A pale gray, threaded with faint rings, like the growth lines inside a tree. The woman crossed herself. She had delivered hundreds of babies, but never one that looked like it had already lived. This was not the first, nor would it be the last. Across 3 counties, enslaved women began giving birth to children with the same eyes. Identical, as if copied, as if stamped, as if remembered. Plantation records would later refer to them as unsettling stock. Church journals used a different phrase, marked infants. And in the basements of Maryland's oldest parishes, a quieter name spread among white clergy and physicians who met behind locked doors. The Returned. What follows is not a ghost story. It is not folklore. It is a reconstruction drawn from sealed letters, burned registries, and testimony never meant to survive. Because for nearly 70 years, Maryland kept discovering slave babies with identical eyes. And no one could explain why. In the early 19th century, Maryland sat at a crossroads, geographic and moral. North enough to pretend restraint, south enough to profit from brutality. Enslaved births were logged like livestock. Weight, health, projected value. But beginning around 1819, a new notation appears in private ledgers, not official records. Eyes, abnormal. The children did not cry immediately. They did not flail. They watched. Enslaved mothers described the same sensation. A pressure behind the eyes. A feeling of being recognized. Some refused to nurse. Others prayed over the infants for hours. A few, quietly, tried to smother them, believing they were not fully human. But plantation owners noticed something else. These children did not sicken easily. They did not bruise as often. They healed fast. And they did not forget. By age 5, they remembered routes through woods they had never walked. By 7, they spoke words no one taught them. Old dialects, half-remembered hymns, fragments of African languages long severed from their bloodlines. Doctors were summoned. Men trained in Enlightenment rationality. Men who measured skulls and believed suffering could be quantified. They found nothing wrong. Same organs, same blood, same bones, except the eyes. One physician, Elias Whitcomb, wrote in a letter later confiscated by the Maryland Senate, "When one of these children looks at you, it is not curiosity. It is assessment." And then something worse happened. The children began to find each other. They were not allowed to meet. Plantations kept them separated once patterns were noticed. Overseers whipped any child who wandered too far. Churches discouraged baptisms involving them. Still, they gathered, always at water, creeks, river bends, swamps. Adults swore the children stood silently in circles, staring into reflections instead of each other. No laughter, no games, just waiting. When questioned, the children gave the same answer, spoken in the same flat tone. "We are listening." Listening to what? That question terrified the clergy more than any superstition. Because around this time, old churches began reporting disturbances beneath their floors. Stone foundations sweating in winter. Bells ringing without ropes pulled. Basements smelling like iron and wet earth. In St. Bartholomew's Parish, workers uncovered a sealed sublevel older than the church itself. No records explained it. No dedication stones named it. Inside were benches carved with fingernail marks, and chains worn smooth by centuries of use. The church sealed it again within hours. And within weeks, 3 more marked children were born in that parish alone. That was when the disappearances began. Between 1825 and 1840, at least 47 enslaved children vanished from records entirely. Not sold, not buried, not emancipated, just gone. Their mothers were told the children had been transferred north for religious education. Some were told the babies died in transit. Others were told nothing at all. But a single surviving ledger from a Baltimore orphanage, never meant to house enslaved children, tells a different story. Names are replaced with numbers. Ages are approximate. Eyes are described with disturbing precision. Specimen 14, ocular pattern consistent. Specimen 22, resistance to prayer. Specimen 31, recognizes symbols without instruction. In the margins, written in a different hand, appears a repeated warning. Do not let them dream together. Because when they did, Staff reported shared nightmares, identical drawings, and one phrase, whispered by multiple children on the same night. The ground remembers us. By 1842, Maryland authorities quietly classified the phenomenon, not as a medical issue, not as a spiritual crisis, but as a containment problem. And containment always leads somewhere darker. The seminary did not appear on any map. It sat beyond a stretch of exhausted tobacco land in southern Maryland, where the soil had been stripped down to pale clay and bones. Officially, the building was a retreat house for clergy suffering spiritual exhaustion. In reality, it was a laboratory. Below the chapel, beneath prayer benches worn thin by knees that had begged forgiveness, there was another structure. Older, stone-cut, windowless. Its entrance was hidden behind the altar. Only bishops, physicians sworn to silence, and men referred to in letters as custodians were permitted inside. This was where the children were taken. Not all at once. Never in groups large enough to raise suspicion. One here, two there. Always at night. Inside the sublevels, the air smelled of chalk dust, iron, and extinguished candles. Cells lined the corridors, not for punishment, but for separation. Because they learned early. When the children were kept apart, they were quiet. When kept together, they changed. The custodians did not believe the children were possessed. That would have been simpler. Instead, they developed a doctrine that never reached public theology, inherited memory. The belief was heretical and terrifying. That extreme trauma could imprint itself so deeply into human consciousness that it did not die with the body. It waited, passed not through blood, but through suffering repeated long enough to carve grooves in reality itself. The seminary journals describe it like this. When pain is ritualized, it becomes a doorway. Enslavement, they believed, had become such a ritual. Chains, auctions, families split apart, bodies disciplined publicly. Over generations, the trauma had thickened, layer upon layer, until something began pushing back through. The children were not remembering their pasts. They were remembering everyone's. The doctors tried everything that felt scientific enough to justify cruelty. Sleep deprivation, isolation, forced prayer, cold water immersion. They showed the children images, burning homes, lynchings, ships, forests, and monitored pulse, breath, pupil dilation. The results horrified them. The children reacted before the images appeared. Heart rates spiked seconds early. Tears formed in anticipation. One physician wrote, "They are not responding. They are recognizing." When subjected to hypnosis, still experimental, the children spoke in voices that were not their own. Old men, women long dead, accents centuries displaced. One child, identified only as Specimen 9, spoke for nearly 6 hours without pause, describing a slave ship so accurately that a naval archivist later confirmed details not publicly recorded. When asked how he knew this, the boy answered, "I was underneath it." Dissection was proposed, not of the brain, of the eyes. Doctors believed the ocular anomaly might store neurological data differently, some physical explanation that could be charted, measured, controlled. 2 children were selected. Only one survived long enough for the attempt. What they found inside the eyes was ordinary, but the drawings made afterward were not. Every physician involved independently sketched the same thing. Concentric rings behind the iris, like tree growth. Like sediment, time layered on itself. One man refused to sign his name to the report. Instead, he scrawled a sentence across the bottom of the page. "These are not children. These are witnesses." That night, the seminary lost power for the first time in its history. Candles extinguished simultaneously. Cells unlocked themselves. And the children began to sing. It was not a hymn. There were no lyrics. Just breath and vibration, low, steady, resonant enough to make stone hum. Staff described it as felt more than heard. Men collapsed. Some wept uncontrollably. Others clawed at their ears until they bled. The children did not move. They stood, eyes open, faces calm. And for the first time, they spoke together. "You built this place on us." When morning came, 13 children were gone. Cells open. No footprints. No blood. Just one message carved into the chapel floor, deep enough to crack stone. Remember, the seminary incident never reached newspapers. Within 48 hours, Maryland officials invoked emergency ecclesiastical authority, an obscure legal mechanism that allowed churches to classify events as spiritual matters. exempt from civil investigation. Witnesses were reassigned. Doctors were transferred north. Records were sealed under vows that carried social and financial ruin for anyone who broke them. And the children? They were not hunted. They were redirected. This marked the beginning of a quiet federal partnership between religious institutions, orphan networks, and medical boards, designed not to destroy the phenomenon, but to dilute it. If the children could not be erased, perhaps they could be scattered. Between 1854 and 1929, thousands of children were relocated across the United States through charitable orphan trains. Publicly, this was framed as mercy. Privately, it was logistics. Marked children were mixed among the displaced. Black, white, indigenous, immigrant. Race no longer mattered. What mattered was isolation. Files from Midwestern parishes described children with unsettling stares, adopted into families that later reported the same patterns. Night terrors shared across siblings, drawings of places they had never seen. And the question that terrified parents most: why does everyone pretend this already ended? In Iowa, in Ohio, in upstate New York, the eyes began appearing again. Something changed after the Civil War. The children born with the eyes were no longer exclusively descendants of enslaved people. Doctors panicked. The doctrine of inherited memory had assumed lineage, trauma passed through bloodlines forged in bondage. But now, children of abolitionists, factory workers, immigrants fleeing famine, they, too, were being born watching instead of crying. The conclusion was unavoidable and horrifying. The memory had jumped hosts. Trauma was no longer contained within ancestry. It had become environmental. The land, the institutions, the unspoken agreements to forget. America itself had become the carrier. In 1891, a boarding school opened under a philanthropic charter in western Pennsylvania. Its mission: educate emotionally withdrawn youth. Internally, it was known as Sight Redfield. The curriculum emphasized silence. Journaling was forbidden. Mirrors were removed. Teachers reported students finishing each other's sentences, knowing when bells would ring before they did, standing at windows during specific hours, always facing south. At night, the children hummed. Low, unified. Staff complained of migraines, intrusive thoughts, and dreams of crowded rooms with no doors. One teacher resigned and later published a single paragraph in a defunct journal. They are not haunted. They are crowded. The school burned down in 1907. Investigators found no accelerant. But beneath the ashes, the foundation stones had cracked inward, as if pressed from below. By the 1920s, religion lost its monopoly on interpretation. Psychology stepped in. The children were reclassified. Not witnesses, not anomalies, but cases. Freud's ideas of repression became tools of denial. Memory was reframed as personal, not collective. Trauma was individualized. Doctors insisted the children were merely sensitive, over-imaginative, absorbing stories from adults. But this explanation collapsed when one child, adopted at birth, no access to oral history, accurately described a lynching that had occurred in her town 50 years earlier, including the names of men never charged. She drew their faces. One was still alive. By the time World War II began, the phenomenon faded from formal discussion, not because it stopped, but because the world became loud enough to drown it out. New traumas layered over old ones. New silences stacked atop older silences. The children grew up. Some became teachers, some ministers, some disappeared into institutions, and some carried the eyes forward, hidden behind contact lenses, glasses, trained expressions. They stopped gathering at rivers. They gathered in archives, in courtrooms, in newsrooms, in quiet positions where memory could be shaped. And beneath all the paperwork in progress, the question remained, unwritten, unanswered. What happens when the witnesses decide they are done waiting? In 1996, during renovations of a condemned courthouse annex in Maryland, workers uncovered a sealed crawl space behind a false wall. Inside was a single iron box. No label, no lock, just a lid fused shut with age and corrosion. When archivists finally forced it open, they found documents wrapped in oilcloth, preserved with almost reverent care. Seminary journals, medical sketches of eyes, orphan transfer lists, and a ledger marked only with a symbol. A circle within a circle within a circle. The archivist who cataloged the box later resigned without explanation. In her exit interview, She left a handwritten note. "This isn't history. This is maintenance." A graduate student noticed it first. She overlaid dates of documented ocular anomalies with major American crises. The alignment was exact enough to feel obscene. The eyes appeared more frequently, before financial collapses, before riots, before assassinations, before wars. Not after, before. As if the children were not remembering the past, but sensing when it was about to repeat. One suppressed memo from 1938 states, "They manifest in advance of rupture." The implication was chilling. The children were not warnings. They were pressure gauges. By the mid-20th century, something shifted again. Adults with the eyes began reporting agency. They no longer dreamed passively. They dreamed strategically, shared dreams, organized dreams. Several civil rights organizers privately noted colleagues who knew where violence would erupt before it did. Journalists who followed instincts that felt inherited rather than learned. None of them spoke publicly about the eyes, but they found each other. Always. In 1948, a final internal report circulated among federal and religious authorities. It concluded, the phenomenon could not be eradicated. Suppression increased intensity. Silence strengthened cohesion. The final recommendation was simple. Let them integrate. Let the memory disperse. Pray it thins. The report ends with a sentence never meant for policy. If they ever remember together again, it will not be to observe. Hospitals no longer log eye color with precision. Midwives still notice things they don't report. Occasionally, a nurse will say a newborn looked at her too long. Occasionally, a child will ask questions that feel old. And sometimes, very rarely, people describe meeting someone whose gaze feels crowded, heavy, layered, as if many lives are looking out through one face. If you have ever felt watched by history itself, if you have ever sensed the past tightening, not fading, it may not be memory failing. It may be memory waking up. Because witnesses do not disappear. They wait. And America has never stopped giving them something to remember. The early doctors were wrong about one thing. The children were never a mistake. They were not an accident of trauma, nor a flaw in inheritance. They were not a sickness that spread. They were a function. In the margins of the seminary journals, written in a hand different from the custodian's, older and less careful, appears a phrase that never entered official doctrine. Memory is the body's last defense. When pain becomes too vast to mourn. When injustice becomes too normalized to name. When systems survive by insisting that forgetting is progress. The human mind does something else. It archives. The children with the eyes were not remembering everything. They were remembering what was denied. Religion teaches redemption through confession. But confession requires acknowledgement. The children did not confess. They did not accuse. They remembered without permission. They carried memory without ritual, without absolution, without hierarchy. And that terrified institutions built on controlling when the past may speak. One suppressed letter from a bishop reveals the real fear. If suffering can testify without language, then authority has no gate. The children did not need sermons. They did not need scripture. They were living proof that history does not require approval to persist. Science tried to isolate the phenomenon. But memory, once collective, cannot be reduced to a specimen. The mistake was assuming the children were holding the past. They were not. They were channeling pressure that already existed everywhere. The eyes were never containers. They were windows. Windows into unresolved violence embedded in land deeds, laws, churches, schools, and polite language. That is why dissection failed. That is why dispersion only delayed it. You cannot scatter a thing that is already everywhere. By the 1950s, the files were buried permanently. Not locked away, but normalized out of existence. Records destroyed. Language softened. Atrocities reframed as regrettable chapters. The strategy worked. For a while, the children stopped being noticed because the country learned how not to look. Eye contact became rude. History became optional. Discomfort became impolite. And memory learned a new way to survive. The phenomenon did not end. It adapted. It moved into intuition, into pattern recognition, into the quiet dread people feel when they sense something is wrong, but cannot explain why. It appears as children who ask questions adults can't answer, as journalists who can't stop digging, as people who feel grief for events they never lived through. Sometimes, it appears as eyes that seem older than the face that carries them. If you've ever felt that history is unfinished, that something beneath the surface is waiting, you are not imagining it. You are sensing accumulation. Because memory does not want revenge. Memory wants witness. And the witnesses were never taken. They were multiplied.